Today we have been singing and telling our stories, the truth about the good news that we've experienced because of Jesus. But what if there never was good news? That was the question we started with 5 weeks ago at the beginning of the series. People always try to invent their own good news, but they end up with more pain, and then they still die, and there certainly isn't much good news following that based on what you've been able to accomplish in your life. Most people have no reason for hope because there's no proven good news, and there never will be. No good news forever, never. The vast majority of people around me, around you, live with that truth, even if they don't acknowledge it. No good news. But there is good news, friends. Right? I heard one person. There is good news, right? Yes. There is good news because God chose to give it as a gift. He didn't have to. We didn't deserve it. And some people have heard and some people have understood because there was somebody who came along in your life who told you the good news, and God, who has the only ability to do this, spoke to your spirit, your soul, said, "Let there be light," and you understood. But somebody came, and as a result, lives were changed. Your life was changed, perhaps, from an immortal horror to a glorious splendor. And your eternal future was changed. You're going to have a new body. There's going to be a new creation, a new earth, new skies. All the old is gone, everything new and everything different, just as God had in mind from the beginning. So there is good news. So, what if you told them about it? The people out there. You have good news from God if you are a believer in Jesus. So learn to tell it well. You have the good news. So what will you say if you're in a conversation and spiritual things start to come up? And somebody asks you, "I don't really get all of this religion stuff. I don't know why so many people are interested in God. I've heard you talk about it before. What's it all about? Can't I just live my life, as it is? Why does God have to interfere in a way like that? I really want to know. Can you tell me about it?" Well, if you are a believer in Jesus, right then, you should relax and be ready and say, "All right, this is the best news ever, and I'm so glad you asked. You really want to know, right? Here's what it is." I said that's how a believer in Jesus should be, but that's not how a lot of believers in Jesus are. They say, before they even get into much of a conversation, they say, "Oh, I hope they don't ask that question. It's coming. And we're thinking, all right, let me give you the phone number of my pastor here. We try to avoid it. But the fact is, you have good news from God. How well do you know that good news story? I'm surprised how many times when even talking to somebody who says that they are a Christian and they go to church regularly, the kind of answer that they give if you ask them, "So do you know for sure that you're going to have eternity with God?" How would you know for sure? I'm surprised by the answers that, as I said, suppose Christians and go to church all the time, they say things like, "Well, that's a good question. I don't really know. I hope so, and I'm trying to do the best I can." That is not God's story. That is not the good news. That's no different than anybody else out there who says, "Well, I'm trying to make the best of my life and I hope it works out." So let's go over this carefully and clearly. God's unique and simple story. It's unique because it stands alone because every other major world religion suggests or tries to tell you you can bridge the gap between you and God by doing something, by your own efforts. But you see, none of the world religions and none of the things they tell you can really give you an absolute evidence of what they say. They can't point to an empty tomb, for one, and they can't give you an absolute assurance that if you do these things, that you will actually arrive. They say, this is the journey, this is the quest, do the best you can, I hope you make it. But God's story says it's done. That's why I said it's unique. An example comes right out of Judaism. In fact, they are like ancient Judaism, or the way that, in fact, it was shaped, like so many religions. It's about doing things, about keeping the law, about the rules. This is what Paul wrote in Romans 10, verse 5. He says, Moses writes this about the righteousness that is by the law. The person who does these things will live by them. See, the law is all about doing, and doing enough to be saved. But that was never even God's intent. That was not his purpose when he gave the law to Israel, to say, hey, keep it all, and then you're going to live with me for eternity, because he knew that they never would. It'd be impossible. All the law ends up doing really is just saying, see, you couldn't make it on your own, could you? But salvation by faith doesn't need to do anything because it's been done. As Paul goes on to say, you don't have to somehow get Christ to come down because God already came. We've had, 2,000 years of Christmases just about. And you don't have to somehow get Christ up, resurrection from the dead, because we got the empty tomb. It's been done. It's done. Listen to what Paul goes on to write. But what does it say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the message concerning faith that we proclaim. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. It is done. So salvation is available right now. What I'm saying will not mean a single thing to you unless you first see how useless it is to try to do more yourself. See, first you need to admit the problem, that there is an unsolvable need, and it's your sin. I've shared this illustration with you before. You've probably seen it somewhere else. Let's call it a morality ladder. It starts off on the bottom, serial killers. The top is God. So maybe, in fact, in talking, sharing with someone, you just pull out a napkin, you draw a simple little ladder like this, put serial killers on the bottom, God on the top. And you say, all right, let's kind of see where some people fit on here. Where would you put Billy Graham? Well, he's not God, but he's pretty well up there. So you put him somewhere there. All right, a lot of people really respect Mother Teresa because of morality and doing good things, they say. So where would you put her? Some people above Billy Graham, maybe some people a little below or even with him. All right, where would you put me, Phil Powers? So, all right, you don't have to answer that. I'll put it on myself. I'm not going to put me above Billy Graham, but I'm not going to put me among serial killers either. So, I'm somewhere down between there. You notice something? In fact, if you're talking to this person and you say, so where would you put yourself? Oh, chances are they won't be the serial killer either. But I can guarantee you they won't be up equal with God. the simple point and the fact where you have to begin, where you have to admit from the start is that we are unlike God. We are separate from Him. Moving up rungs of the ladder isn't going to work. Trying to be one of the few who make it. Do you see what you're trying to say? That eventually you're going to be just like God Himself? Oh, come on. You need to admit that we are born with a nature that is so unlike God that we will always hit the ceiling. We will always fall short. And there's no getting around it. See, doing good works more, cleaning up your life and straightening things out in terms of relationship with God is kind of like saying, I just need to dump more good eggs into this omelet that has a rotten egg in it. It's still unedible. Something has to be done to get rid of what's rotten. That is the unsolvable need, and that's where you have to start there, to admit it. That's part of God's story. But let's be sure we understand the rest of the good news from God. How simple it is, how necessary it is, and I'll give you another diagram. A chasm. We are on one side, God is on the other. And just as we talked in that morality ladder, there is so much of a difference between us and God, so much of a separation. It doesn't matter how high up you are on that ladder. There's a chasm that cannot be bridged. And the result of that chasm is death. Death means separation, by the way. When you die physically, the spirit is separated from your body, right? I'm dead to you. I'm separate from you. We are born in that condition of separated from God, and that means that when we die physically, it stays that way, of course, forever, separated from God and everything that has to do with Him. That's our situation. But to believe what God did about it, that God took on flesh and blood. Jesus came, and He says, you deserve the death, but I will take it for you. I will be your substitute. I will die in your place. And because He is God, the grave didn't hold Him. He rose from the dead. He said, see, I give you now my life. I took your sin. I give you my life. You're forgiven. But only if you receive it. You believe, but then you have to confess. You need to confess. You must surrender to say, I trust, I cross, I come over. I turn from who I was. I come to you, God, because you are my Lord. Jesus is my Lord. So the admitting, the believing, the confessing, it's just what Jesus said. He promised in John 5, I tell you the truth. Whoever hears my word and believes Him who sent me has eternal life and will not be condemned. He has crossed over from death to life. As Paul wrote in Romans 10, which we just read, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. Jesus is Lord. Not just saying the words, but it is to believe and to accept Him. He is my Lord. That is the bottom line, friends. That is the bottom line. It is a responding in faith to the good news from God. Jesus is my Lord. He died for me, and I believe in Him. As Paul wrote in Romans 10 and verse 11, anyone who believes in Him, as the Scripture says, will never be put to shame. It's a freedom from the judgment. It's the only good news that will carry a person not only through this life, with a pilot light that is lit, a change that has begun, but also for the eternity of the afterlife, because it's a done deal. It's open to anyone, to all people, and that means you today. Right here, right now. It means it's open to you. And to you. Every one of you. It doesn't matter what you've done in your past. No matter how far you've wandered away, no matter how far your life has been wrapped around the wheel of this life trying just to survive and get through, God's invitation is this. Stop trying to do enough to earn my acceptance. I've already built the bridge. Just cross it by faith. I built it for you out of love. Oh, my child, please come home. That's the invitation. So, if you are a believer in Jesus already, don't you see? You and I can confidently tell our friends and our family that the bridge that they are looking for has already been built. It's already done. It's completed. Construction is finished. God's bridge is ready to be crossed. All that remains is the question of what you're going to do. Will you give up? Will they give up their own efforts, construction efforts to make their life right? Or will they walk across the bridge that's already been built? Will they continue hoping for the impossible? Or will they see it's already done? See, one choice leads to nothing more than behavior modification, and then you die a modified behavior. The other is a transformation of your very soul and who you are, with a spirit that is alive with God for eternity, and a new body and a new creation to come. That is the good news from God. But if you are a believer in Jesus, you already have a story to tell. Because for you, we've done this series of what ifs. For you, there is no what if the good news never changed me or my future, because the good news has changed you. So tell it. See, every follower of Jesus has good news that fits right into God's story. It's the evidence of what God's grace can do. Even angels are watching and waiting to see how it's all played out in your life and in the connections of your life. The angels are watching and waiting. So be prepared to tell your story, just as unique and just as simple. Learn it well. It may be that you came to faith later in life and you say, oh yeah, I got a story to tell. It may be that you trusted Jesus as your Savior when you were just a child early on. You say, I don't know if I have much of a story to tell. Oh, yes, you do. You do, because you still live in a world full of disappointments. So many disappointments. And you have a story to tell about how you have chosen to keep God's appointment, and God made an appointment with you. And bringing that together, there's a transformation. You are changed. You are different. Maybe, make clear that it's not about how you're trying to change your life or your behavior. It's what God is doing you as you are training, as learning to trust and obey Him because He is your Lord. So share stories, maybe about your temperament, what God has done, how God has changed the way that you are wired, how He changes the weaknesses in you. Maybe you are easily distracted. I mentioned a few weeks ago about my wife who is easily distracted. I didn't get in trouble. She found out I told you. I think she was in nursery that day, but she found out. I didn't get in trouble because, you see, she has a story to tell. She has part of her story which could and should be your story if, in fact, you're easily distracted too. You know, where you're doing this and that, and oh yeah, sure, I'll do that. Oh, I can help out there, and soon your life is so busy, so full. So part of her story is, part of your story could be, yeah, I've had to learn to say no, and I've had to learn to, and it's not easy, but to make a time for me and God. But you know what the other part of the story is? God wired you that way. And there are those times when God says, I got a job, who's going to go? And you just hear about it secondhand. Ooh, me, I'm going. And phew, off you go. And in a wonderful way, you're meeting a person's need where everybody else is like, well, we got to plan this out, we got to think this through. But you're off doing it. And it's a wonderful thing. Tell that part of the story. Or maybe God has made you, wired you more a contemplative person. That's how you were your whole life. But because of Jesus and your contemplative wiring, you've been able to see the beauty of a sunset in a way that other people can't see. You've been able to hear music in a way that other people don't hear. You've been able to maybe express yourself or just marvel at the awesome wonder of God, the complexity of who He must be beyond what I can even imagine. And that He would give me senses to see and enjoy that just because He loves me. You have that part of the story to tell. Maybe part of your story needs to be about the seasons of your life and what you saw God do and what you learned, how you kept on with sanity, how you kept on with trust. At a time when, in an earlier season of life, maybe some of you the present season of life, surrounded by kids and chaos. Or maybe it was your wife's illness. Or maybe it was the unexpected career change that was not a pleasant thing. Say, but this is what God showed me. This is what I learned about myself. This is what I learned about Him. It's part of your story. Maybe part of your story needs to be about how you had times of life, dry seasons, times of doubt. Speak about it honestly and say, there came a point when I realized that there is no alternative truth, and I came back to the good news, the only thing that really matters. In fact, it was that time that really kind of proved it to me. Or tell about part of your story, how you have hope in this life, despite of all the things that are happening, and all the fear, and the shootings, and the bombings, and the terrorism, and the refugees, and the diseases, and the pollution, and everything else. You say, but I have hope, and I'm not afraid to die. Let me tell you why. See, that's your story. You have a story of God's grace in your life. You need to tell it. Some don'ts. Don't tell your story. Don't make the story about the strangest experience you've ever had with God. Yeah, I was driving down the road one day and I heard a voice coming from the back seat. I knew no one was back there, so I turned to look, and the wheel turned, and I just missed hitting a child by that much. Well, that's a wonderful story of God's protection in your life. But that is not a story that will help them to see the power of Jesus to change a life. They need to know about Jesus. Also, another don't. Don't go on and on and on with a mini novel of your life. Yeah, started at a young age. I was in nursery school, and keep it brief and simple because you want them to know that grace is simple. And give them time to ask some questions, maybe. Don't go down rabbit trails with a dozen different plots and 16 main characters. All those things that God did in your life. Again, keep it clear and to the point. Make it about Jesus. Also, avoid the insider jargon that you pick up after you've been taught for a while in groups of believers or in the assembly of believers. It's the simple, straightforward story. What difference has Christ made in my life? As I said, It may be that you have a dramatic before and after kind of story to tell. It may be that you came to faith when you were quite young, and the story that you tell is, come on, you're smart enough, I'm smart enough too. I could say, I know where I could have been because I see where people ended up, and I know how I am wired, and I know what I could have done. So let me tell you the difference. Let me tell you why I am as I am and what could have been, maybe. Sometimes you have the dramatic story, like a Paul could be, Apostle Paul, before and after. But the simple point is, you say, I changed directions, and then God changed me. Like Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15, it's by the grace of God I am what I am. See, that's what you say before and after. The main thing that I am willing, why I'm willing to devote my entire life to Jesus. Here's why. Here's what it is. Why I love him above all else. And finally, the good news must be spoken. It has to be spoken, has to be told. There is a reason Jesus in John's Gospel is called the Word and not called the good deed or the sign or the miracle. Even though he did many signs and miracles and they were important to him, and those things showed his authority, it showed God's love, it helped meet people's needs, and it opened up the door for more conversation. But for Jesus, it was his words, it was what he had to say that was the most important thing. See, what Jesus really wanted was for people to hear what he said and to believe. Not to think of him as, oh, the guy who does good deeds. At some point, friends, words are necessary. The good news must be spoken. You can't just try to show it. You have to speak it. Paul writes in Romans 10, how then can they call on the one that they have not believed in? How can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? How can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. So, work backwards here, because the goal here is to be saved, which is by calling on the name of the Lord. So what's the sequence? What are the steps that have to happen leading up to that? Well, first, before they call, you have to believe. Before you believe, you need to hear. God has to open your mind, your soul to hear, and somebody has to come and tell you. And before they can tell you, they have to be sent to you. They have to have gone. Now, the point about the beautiful feet, listen up here. The point about the beautiful feet is telling, that's why the emphasis there. Telling is an absolute necessity if people are going to hear and to believe. And of that list, there is one box already checked off. You've already been sent. Because we believers have the good news and we are already living among them. Paul writes in Romans 10, verse 17, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. It's the kind of hearing that can lead to faith, the kind that can only happen if they are given the definite message that Jesus is the Lord and He rose from the dead. They have to be told. People are singing all sorts of Christmas carols these days. And as we mentioned before, they don't know it's good news. It's when somebody comes to them and says, let me tell you. Let me tell you what God's story is. Let me tell you my story. Let me tell you what He's done in my life. Because you see, the whole thing with God, it's not just Christmas carols. It's relationship. And you are there with a relationship you already have with God as a believer in Jesus, to see them come into a relationship that He's offering to them right now. They have to be told. Being a resource person, showing you care and giving help can open doors, can make a difference in somebody's life today. It can put food on the table today, clothes on their back today. But what about for eternity? It's the story of Jesus that makes the eternal difference. So learn and practice God's story and your story. You have the best story to tell. The angels are watching and waiting. Someone's eternity is in the balance. So ask the Holy Spirit to open up those conversations and opportunities. Keep your eyes open, ears alert, look for it. And then relax and tell them the most powerful, best good news you could ever say.